When you're hiring people, how do you distinguish between people um, who have done this, this, who understand themselves better versus those who don't?
If my job all day is to write code, and I assess it on sitting in front of you writing code, it's pretty accurate, right? Either you do it effectively or you don't. But then, coming back to your question, you then also have to have a way by which we assess kind of what you're referring to as a level of authenticity, right? And so for us, we think about that first through the skills lens, which I outlined, but then second through this idea of a values assessment. And so the reason values are important, when we look at careers, we see a correlation between the people who are most values aligned and doing great work. Because if you show up every day and I hang out with you and you and I share a lot of values, like, of course, not only are we going to feel more comfortable together, we're going to be able to share ideas. There's a level of psychological safety and value alignment, right? So as a result, you start to see people do more and better work. If we're going to bring this person into our organization and they have the skills to do the job, even more so, they have to be aligned with our values at Cuttering.
In Youth We Trust sits down with successful entrepreneurs, business leaders, educators, and others from around the world. We spotlight how individuals and organizations are shaping a better world, directly or indirectly, for the coming generations through their focus on sustainability, equity, education, and more to empower young people to create the future they deserve. And now, in Youth We Trust.
Hi, Rob. Welcome to the podcast in Youth We Trust.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm very excited too. You're the first global leader of talent that we've invited to this show, and there's a very specific reason why I say I'm quite excited, because Lumi is all about young people, and it's about future work. It's about empowering this next generation, etc. But ultimately, a lot of these people will have to face people like you or people from your team. And I think it's important that in this session we bring out how you think and how they should think, and how what we are doing actually can influence some of that. When you were younger, uh, and growing up, was there a quest, which is in Lumi parlance, a problem that you saw around you that you really wanted to solve?
Yes.
So why don't we just talk a little bit about that and then see where it goes?
That's a big question. I think that when I was young, I think I was probably like a lot of other, young kids, kind of a bit of a nerd, kind of trying to work out, how do I come to exist properly in this world that you kind of see evolving and moving and changing around you. So in that way, and I'm not sure if this is the way to answer your question, but I wasn't necessarily so globally focused. I think that I was very focused on trying to solve all the complexity that I came to understand in myself. And so I think I spent a lot of time trying to understand the interplay between people and adults and the world and all these kinds of things. And honestly, that probably has remained a theme today, and how that has evolved has really come down to helping other people understand themselves better, because I've been working on that for a little while without revealing my age. So I think maybe that if I come back to your question, the problem I was trying to solve is how do we come to understand ourselves better?
That's a brilliant quest to be on. I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, I am on that quest, but I started at the grand old age of 43, which was 7 years ago. So,
Last week.
so I think I took way too long to come to that point. But so do you think, when you were thinking about how we can understand ourselves better, did you find any success or progress on that front?
Yeah,
Or
I
did you
hope so.
struggle?
Or wasted a few decades. Which maybe wasted isn't the right language. To your second point, struggle for sure. I don't think it's easy. I don't care if you're 7 years old or if you're, to your point, a young ripe old age of 39 and holding. I think it's it's complicated. I think for me, I've consistently looked at what are the frameworks by which I should process experiences. What are the frameworks by which I should process emotions, etc. So I think going deep into all of it, I think a lot of it comes down to being present. I think often we're very distracted. I think often we're experiencing too many things. I don't honestly think social media is helping, and I think that we struggle with all these thoughts, emotions, experiences, and that can make people feel very flooded. And when we're flooded, we can be quite overwhelmed, and we see this every day. And I'm sure everybody who listens to your podcast has experienced this. You often find yourself in a situation and you're thinking, how did I even get here? Like, what has happened today? I talked to a lady last week, and it was early in the morning, and she was having her coffee, and I said, how's your morning? And she said, do you know what? I was having a sip of coffee just then, and I don't even remember driving here. And I was like, wow, which is, potentially a little bit frightening if you are a driver or a person who spends time on roads. So what it comes down to for me is, first, how do we develop the skill set, the means by which we can become more present with ourselves? And what I mean by that is, how do we become more present with our thoughts? And how do we become more present with our feelings? And I think for everybody, and from what I've learned through being a coach for a long time and through managing teams and through obviously managing myself, is everybody kind of has two experiences. Either they have a thought pop up, right, and that causes them to feel a certain way, or they have a feeling and that causes them to think a different way. Now, from a science perspective, of course, there isn't a consistent way by which that happens. But I think the first things for a lot of people, or the things that I've learned, is first we have to be aware of what those things are. And it's like the old saying, right? We can't measure it, we can't manage it. Once we become aware of our thoughts and our feelings, then we have the opportunity to kind of get a bit of a handle on them. Like, how do we manage sadness, happiness, anger, whatever the thing is you're experiencing? How do I manage these thoughts of, this person thinks that, or this experience happened, or what have you? So I think that's probably at the core of it. And without being verbose, I think a lot of the challenges that we see people experience today, particularly when people are younger, really can be solved, I think, more effectively by just first coming back to, where am I at right now? Centering myself as best I can, getting my thoughts and my feelings under control, and then being able to approach whatever problem or situation I face thereafter.
That's interesting. Do you think that people of today's generation, young people, they are, on the one hand, whilst they are very distracted and overwhelmed by information, do they have better tools to be able to deal with or to be able to understand themselves better?
I'm not sure, but the word tools gets stuck with me a little bit, but I think I hear what you're saying. I think that they have better access. I think that better access is a word that I think that I would probably insert there. And so what I mean by that is, whether we think about the ability to find answers to your questions, or to access information about, whether it's self-awareness or what have you, I don't think we've ever had in history a better ability to access information very quickly. But I think for a lot of young people, particularly now, we see this rise of this sort of influencer culture. I think with that access comes a lot of danger, in that, who do you trust? What information do you now understand to be correct or accurate? This challenge between precision and accuracy. And so I think it comes down to, again, learning how to think. Like, how do we think about finding the information? How do we discern what is right and wrong? How do we discern what is real, right? Now we spend a lot of time on AI. I know you and I are going to talk about this, but here at Karim, and now we can see that we even have influencers. So if you're on Instagram, if you're on TikTok, whatever social media that you choose, now you're starting to see this rise of influencers who aren't even people, right? We're starting to see AI designed and developed influencers, right? And then AI is also able to create the life and the process and the energy around that influencer. So nothing about it is real, right? So I think we have access, but the new skill set that I think is going to be a critical one for people moving forward is, how do we derive or come to understand what is true? And I think that's going to be a huge skill set for anybody into the future.
I hear it again and again and again. I think Yeah, and that's the critical thinking, understanding what's true versus what's not, being able to apply your judgment. I think it's a difficult one. It's a difficult one because the world's become much more fast paced as well, and you've got a lot coming at you. So I think the reason I'm asking this question is, so what do you do to make this better for people? As somebody who has spent so much time, reflecting on, understanding oneself, but also with people, especially focused on the people aspect of organizations, what would you suggest, if anything?
Yeah, I think again, like I would index on coming to a level of self-understanding first, right? Because we can't perceive the outside world if we can't understand what's going on within ourselves, right? It's going to influence and bias how we process information. But then I think it comes down to your values thereafter, right? So as we gain a level of self-awareness and self-understanding, within that, I think you can take a step forward and say, okay, now what matters to me? Like what are the things? And of course this can evolve as you gain more experiences, as you get older, as whatever happens. But I think there's a lot of value in people and this might go a little bit esoteric, but in this first, like what is my vision for my life, right? And again, that can evolve and change over time. That how do I see myself kind of walking through this this big crazy experience? Like, and when I get to the end, what do I want it to look like? Like, what do I want to have? Not necessarily achieved, right? I think we over-index on that a little bit. I've got to have done these things. I've got to have a master's degree, and I worked at a company and did a thing, right? Like, okay, like great. I think, but all of those things more often should be a part of a bigger journey, right? If the only thing is to have a specific job and that's your whole career focus, I think you're going to get to the end of the journey and kind of be like, well, I might have missed, might have missed a couple things in that whole experience that I could have had. So I think the first step is what is roughly speaking, a vision for where I want to go in my life. And again, that's a big question, but it's worth sitting down and having a cup of coffee and thinking about what could it be. And that's a lot of fun, right? Like, what is this cool thing I've got ahead of me? What do I want it to look like? Within that, then I think when you have a bit of a vision for what you want to experience, then what are the values that I want to use as an overlay? So through this journey, right, whatever you want to call it, where you're going to experience a lot of things that are very hard. You're going to experience a lot of things that are they're not so hard. Things will make you sad. Things will make you angry. But coming back to your question, I think what's important within that is then what are the values set by which I'm going to process those experiences so that I have a bit of continuity and I'm able to control my path a little bit. What are those values give us some guardrails. So I think there's value in sitting down and thinking if I define my personal values and this is different and should be different for everything and everyone, what are they? What are the things that really deeply matter to me as a person? And so I think that's important. Sitting down, and there's some great books for this. Of course, there's some great design thinking books on how you can come to understand yourself better, how you can kind of minimize or shortlist those values, and sitting down and mapping those so that they feel right to you. And then I think to your point, as you find yourself in these challenging situations that will inadvertently happen for everybody and you don't know what to do about it, which again happens for everybody, you can fall back on those first principles or those values, which is like, well, what do I value, right? What are the things in my life that I think are my virtues? And I think that's an easy way, much easier way to make those decisions rather than, kind of sticking your finger in your mouth and holding it up and seeing which way the wind is blowing. So, and I think that gives you more consistency and being more true to yourself as a result.
And when you're hiring people, regardless of their level, how do you distinguish between people who have done this, who understand themselves better versus those who don't, so therefore
Mm,
people know the difference between, I can't fake it. I genuinely need to make an attempt to understand myself because people who might be hiring me can see through things that I'm trying to come across as, but frankly, I'm not.
yeah, that's a great question. So I think it's worth having a caveat that is like, of course, when we hire people, we're usually doing it within an organizational context, right? If it was just me hiring for myself, my answer might be a little different. It means that if my job all day is to write code and I assess it on sitting in front of you writing code, it's pretty accurate, right? Either you do it effectively or you don't. But then coming back to your question, you then also have to have a way by which we assess kind of what you're referring to, a level of authenticity, right? And so for us, we think about that first through the skills lens, which I outlined, but then second through this idea of a values assessment. And so the reason values are important, coming back to my earlier comment, is that when we look at careers, when we look at people who want to have a career over time, and they want to be successful, right? Most people don't have a career and they think, geez, I really, really want to make a mess of this. And so we see a correlation between the people who are most values aligned and doing great work. Because if you show up every day and I hang out with you and you and I have share a lot of values, like, of course, not only are we going to feel more comfortable together, we're going to be able to share ideas. There's a level of psychological safety and value alignment, right? So as a result, you start to see people do more and better work. So we spend a lot of time in the second bucket, making sure that if we're going to bring this person into our organization and they have the skills to do the job, even more so, they have to be aligned with our values at Cutting. And so I think we spend time on that and being able to say, like, if we think about building a lasting institution together, like, what does that mean to you? Like, how would you do it? How have you contributed in the past? And we would use a behavioral interview model there, which again is very high efficacy or higher efficacy, to ensure that the way you think through an idea and the way you value doing work is closely aligned with us. The alternative is if we totally don't have a values alignment, one, we're probably not going to emphasize or focus on the right things together, but also it's not going to be a lot of fun to work together. So that's kind of how we think about it in the simplest sense.
This episode is brought to you by Lumi.network. We're on a mission to help the next generation prepare to take on the world. Our AI-augmented platform runs quests that help 10 to 25-year-olds shape their future by developing AI, entrepreneurship, and design thinking skills to solve the most pressing business and social issues. If you or your organization wants to impact the next generation positively, we'd love to talk to you. To learn more, visit Lumi.network.
So let's look at what the let's bring back the focus on young people, because that's really what the people that the organization that I'm building is trying to influence and shape in some way. If I look at the current education systems, right, and the changes that are happening in the world around us with AI and with climate and everything else, we are noticing a trend where there's a bit of anxiety, there's a bit of excitement in young people, there's a lot of confusion. But one thing remains the same. When the people are coming out of these education systems, employers like us are saying you're not quite ready. You're not really skillful. So do you see that problem, or do you feel that when you are looking at younger talent, that the education system is delivering what it's supposed to deliver, fit for you?
So the first thing that comes to mind for me is that I think the education system on a global basis is in a really tough spot. I think that historically it was a certain thing was asked of it, and I don't think anybody's asking for that anymore. So I think that it has to go through a pretty rapid evolution. And I think a lot of organizational or a lot of education organizations are doing that. But I don't feel like it's happening maybe as fast as a lot of organizations would like. So are they producing what we want? I think we try to be malleable, I think is the word. So, can we affect what is produced by education institutions? We can, right? So we really have to be able to say, as an organization, how do we adjust ourselves to kind of catch the talent as it is going to be thrown at us? And so we, particularly in our regions, we have incredible institutions that are producing great talent. To your question, are they producing talent that can immediately come out of their final year and sit down at a desk and do great work? Almost. I think it's okay. But the way we would sort of look at that problem is, if it's not there, what are we designing to catch that talent, invest in its development, and get it to where we need it, right? So we kind of act as a stopgap as well as an end game.
Do you think institutions like or companies can start to influence in a greater way. Um, as one of my other guests put it, quite provocatively, she said, organizations are lazy. They basically just want to look at your degree and just hire you because there's no other thing that they can do. And then they basically just bring you in to do whatever work they want you to do. They're not really asking for anything different from education either, which is why nothing has changed.
Hmm. So I think there's a bunch of different ways to address this, right? I think first, some organizations are pushing hard on educational institutions to adjust. And so I think Kareem is a good example. I think that we've spent a good amount of time with the different institutions, educational institutions in our region, partnering with them to help them understand this is the type of talent we want. This is the type of skills that we want. Um, I think it was a month ago we had our CTO in Pakistan meeting with different educational institutions and saying, look, we love the partnership. We're very fortunate to have great relationships with a lot of the universities in the region. But to your point, I think it has to be a partnership. I don't think it's necessarily about organizations stamping their feet and saying graduates have to look like this. And in the same way, I think a lot of the educational institutions do have to be closely aligned with commerce to say, like, what is the skills map or the skills journey for the future. And I think the partnerships should certainly be improved across the region. I think there could be much closer alignment and much more investment in what we're doing to help graduates come out and be ready. So if some organizations are lazy, they probably wouldn't be my number one partner. But I think where we have to index is on the organizations that are willing to do the work, willing to partner, and really letting them, do the work and start changing the landscape. But it has to be a two-way street, and I think that's obviously lacking in some cases.
Yeah, it is. I think. And how do you see companies collaborating with education? Do you think that companies like Kareem should collaborate with only with universities, or do you think that there is a role that you can play in schools as well? Because the way I see it is a lot of the foundational development of a human being happens in school. They they've already calcified some of their values, their habits, their skills by the time they're coming out of university. But is it realistically possible to work with schools?
Look, it's a huge landscape, right? So I think the first thing to think about, and I'll be really transparent. I'm certainly not a university specialist, but what I've seen in my experience is first, um, often organizations make the assumption that everybody can go to university. Um, and I think this is a mistake, right? I think, from my upbringing and like a lot of people that I know, across the region and across the world, the university is largely unachievable for a lot of people, right? So for organizations to assume that the smartest people in the world all went to university, I actually don't believe is accurate or correct. And in fact, if you look at some of the founders that I've worked with, I'm very fortunate to spend time at Apple, very fortunate to spend time at Uber. If you do enough research, you realize none of these founders even graduated. So you're like, well, what are we doing here? Like, what on earth are we thinking, right? So the assumption that smart people go to university, I think, is fundamentally flawed. So then how do we think laterally or differently about talent? I think that's really, really important. And it comes back to something that we talked about earlier, which is I don't think success comes down to a piece of paper. And I'm highly biased in this thing. A university is not a thing that, in my personal value set, is super heavily weighted. I assign value to it. I appreciate the effort that people put into it, and I do think it's important. However, when we think about this idea of what does an organization need, or maybe even more importantly, what does an individual need to have a good life and to be successful within whatever context they believe is important, it does come down to this ability to understand what you wish to achieve and just get it done. Whether that's making pottery or being an athlete or I don't know, whatever it is that you do you, right? But I think it comes down to this skill set of first, what are the skills I need to be good at me, right? And then hopefully you can learn that. What are the skills I need to build to take myself along this journey, right? And those are very specific. I think they're very tangible skills. And I think that's often where university gets a bit off track, which is like it becomes very ultimately theoretical. And honestly, like I can't tell you every day when I sit down at my desk and think, geez, what theory am I going to apply here? Like I don't think I've ever done that in my career, right? But what I do think about is what are the tangible ways we can solve this problem? And then how do we address it? How do we approach it? Who are the people I need in the room? And then ultimately, how do I facilitate a great outcome? So I think the thing that's important within that is how do we help anybody, education aside, to simply understand how to achieve things, whatever it is.
Yeah, I think this reinforces the point that I was actually the reason why I was asking this question, that organizations need to get more involved with schools. And what you're saying here is, I think a lot of people, when they listen to this, when they listen to the fact that values are extremely, well, valuable when you're applying for a job, not just your university degree or your grades or your achievements, because ultimately you have to learn to work with different people. And that's what's going to start coming through. What value system do you work with? What do you consider important? I think this message is important, but also to go one step beyond and to start actually helping people build these skills in an equitable fashion. Let's shift the topic a little bit into something more controversial, particularly when it comes to companies like Kareem or Uber and things like that. Look,
Yeah.
one of the things we are hearing from young people is that one study says that over 75% of under 18s are have climate anxiety. And now we are seeing the emergence of AI anxiety. So I want to just briefly touch upon these topics. How will you, as a company which is about ride hailing, how are you thinking about the topic of sustainability?
Mm,
Are you a net positive or a net negative for society?
Oh, it's a big question. It's a big question. I'll have to draw on the climate science degree that I don't have. But I think that it's a huge question. Look, I mean, I'm as an individual, I am very, very. Maybe if I go back half a step to finish your last line of thinking, I think one caveat that I would put in all of this is that the individual, you've called out like what's the role of industry, what's the role of government, et cetera. I think this all comes down to what is the individual doing about it? I can't control what the government does. I can't control what the educational institutions do. And if I think back on my own experience, my question to myself would be, what are you doing about it? So, how are we addressing sustainability? So there's a whole bunch of ways we can address this one as well. So first, we're very fortunate, our head office being here in Dubai. Obviously, we have the government very publicly coming out and saying they want to get to net neutral by 2050. And I think that initiative is important. It's important to see that it's being verbalized. I think the visual is important on a global stage to say that we're going to put something in writing to get us where the world needs to go. Of course, there's arguments about why couldn't it be faster? Sure. I think that's valid. So we're lucky to exist in a place where there is influence around sustainability. So what is Kareem doing? I think sustainability matters to us. All of us, or not all of us, but a lot of us have kids. All of us currently exist in the world, right? So do we want a world that continues to get hotter? Do we want a world that continues to see habitat destruction? I'm not going to get going on this one because it's something that's very important to me. I mean, myself and my family are very, on an individual and on a community basis, very, very focused on the environment. We're very, very focused on how do we interact with the world. But look, what are the things that Kareem are doing? So we've launched a battery-driven fleet of bikes now. So for our captains to make sure they're delivering on a vehicle that has less environmental impact. You now have the ability within the app, which I think is kind of cool, to make a selection as an individual. So we think about this idea of individual ownership, of selecting a car that is battery powered versus fossil fuel. So that comes down to the consumer sentiment, right? The consumer decision that matters to them. So in many ways, I don't think we would take a decision of making decisions on behalf of the consumer. But as much as we can, we're trying to say, look, we're going to give you a platform for you to make decisions that you believe, based on your values, are important. We really hope that you make the right decision. And then on top of that, a lot of the cars in the fleet as well are hybrid as well, right? So I think for us, what are we doing as an organization? I think a whole lot, but a lot of it comes down to what the consumer wants as well. So again, it's a partnership, as I was saying before.
Yeah, I think the issue that I see there is, and I see this across the world, and when it comes to sustainability, the narrative is such that an average individual feels unconcerned or helpless, right? There is this, these are the two prevailing sentiments. So therefore you think like, oh, what difference will it make to the climate if I don't do X or Y, Z? Sometimes it's an excuse, sometimes it's an admission of helplessness. So I would argue that in many cases, giving them a choice is making them feel guilty they're making the wrong choice. I think the organization should take greater steps to say, I think you should make that choice. And frankly speaking, if you want to hail a cab, it has to be a green cab, and therefore you should be prepared to pay a bit more, because we know better than you climate is changing and we are in a greater position to influence it. Why shouldn't organizations like Kareem, but not just Kareem, any organization take that harder step to prevent the decision lying with them?
Yeah, it's a big question. I think, look, my very short answer would be is I don't see ample examples of organizations that try to mandate what the consumer should do as being very successful, unfortunately. So while I think that would be a noble clause in saying, yes, we're going to tell you what you should do, unfortunately, I think that you would not be a very sustainable company thereafter. So I think with any kind of change process, whether you're thinking about changing your kid's breakfast cereal or you're thinking about changing a state or a province or a country, that change has to be incremental, right? And we've seen this, in my own personal life, like my family and I, we haven't been consumers of the meat industry for probably, geez, now coming up on, well, I won't show off my age, but probably almost 30 years, right? So we haven't had any animal products in our house, and we believe really strongly that. And of course, we don't push that on anybody. That's our prerogative, and we don't necessarily believe other people need to believe the same things as us. But we take every step possible to minimize and mitigate the impact that we have on the world, right? But look, it's like if I talk to my friends, and people are often curious. They're like, "Oh, so wow, what's it like being a vegan?" When the standard question is like, "Where do you get your protein?" Which, frankly, is a little old these days. But if I was to say to those people, they bang my fist on the table and say, "You have to be a vegan," like it doesn't. Of course, it doesn't work, right? People are like, "Oh, I can't give up cheese," or "I really like eating hamburgers," right? Like, again, like, okay, like you do that, but you should be clear that that has a derogatory impact on the world. So I think you have to gently introduce things to people. And you have to say, "Look, here's why I think this is important. I.e., here's a solution. You can choose. You can choose a hybrid car. You can choose that. Is it hard? It's super easy. You don't need to feel guilty. The price is almost exactly the same. Just make the choice, right?" But if we say no, you know, you can only have this one type of car, then people are like, "Well, I'll just go to this other platform."
No, I think the point here that I'm taking away from this is there are certain things that an individual can do, certain things an organization can do, and certain things only a government can do. This requires a policy level intervention. This is going back to, it requires people these institutions working in conjunction to say, look, if we offer that, if we put the hammer and say you have to only make this choice, we're going to go out of business. But if you as a government say that, basically a certain type of vehicle is not fit for use in this country, then no one has that choice. I'm not losing out because it's a level playing field for all companies. AI is another thing which I think when it comes to free will, it's kind of starting to impede on that territory. um, there are several questions I have in my mind on AI when it comes to a tech company like yours or all the companies that you work for. um, the first one is, do you look now you are you beginning to look for AI readiness or AI literacy in people that you hire? Or are you beginning to value it?
Mm. The short answer is yes. I think we have been for some time. I think, most of the world is aware of the huge potential for commercial benefit with not only people, but systems and organizations that are enabled by AI, right? So short answer is yes. Are we using it as a hurdle? Not necessarily. Of course, outside of a data and AI function, it's not a hurdle, but of course it is within that function.
Hmm. And do you think having this skill is essential to be successful in the future job market?
I think that if I speak just to tech, I think it will become a very key and core skill for most tech jobs because there's just so many different use applications. And I think the question you also have to ask is like, how does AI evolve specifically? So if you think about it as an overlay to an industry, how does AI as an intelligence tool change? And I think with time, what you'll start to see is AI will specialize, right? So you won't just have Chat GPT and you ask all your random questions to Chat GPT and it pushes out some kind of answer. You're already seeing this across AI as you're specializing in this AI only creates as images. This AI only creates background. This AI only speaks in this way. This is your AI for work. This is your AI for talking to your friends, right? So I think with time, the diversification of the tool and therefore its impact on your life will make it very difficult for it to not be a core skill. Unless you're a forest ranger or something and you get to live in the forest, which sounds lovely. But I mean, even then, it'll probably be key. So yeah, I think it becomes core to tech. How much it impacts other industries, I think, is starting to see you're starting to see huge influence on other industries as well. So yeah, it is becoming a very much a core skill, regardless of what you do.
The second question about AI, which is something that everybody wants to hear, is how do people like you see this? In the workforce, do you see this ultimately creating a net AI being a job creator or ultimately a job destroyer?
No, I think it becomes a job creator, but as a result of those jobs being created, those in jobs now have to evolve. So, there's lots of examples of this with other tools that have come through. But no, I think it will create an entirely new series of jobs, entirely new economics within that. But as a result of that, jobs that exist today may cease to exist, and jobs that exist today may change drastically. So I think within this, when we think about the theme of this conversation, if I'm starting my career now, not only is this ability to learn become critical, but maybe at a higher level, this idea of being agile becomes very, very important. And agile being how do I reach back into these experiences that I have, whether that's university or upbringing, whatever. How do I draw on those experiences to very quickly learn about this experience I find myself in and accelerate through it? And how do I create a bit of a flywheel effect? I think when we think about talent, this next generation of talent, if it is going to be skills based, that generation is going to have to bring those skills up pretty fast, right? So you're going to have a bit of a toolkit and be able to utilize them quickly. So I think with AI, we're seeing a demand on the next generation, which is pretty extreme in terms of the levels of agility they're going to need to employ.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think agility is a key point. But then, a lot of the world, digital, when they go onto the digital platforms, pay attention to what Mr. Musk is saying. And here he was at a tech conference in Paris saying, "I think work is going to be entirely optional in the, in the coming, uh, you know, f- I don't know whether he said years or decade, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. Work is going to be entirely optional." So he's going out there saying the influence of AI on the world is going to be so great that there is no work. How do people like you who are in the talent space what do you make of that statement?
I mean, he's been on that message for a while, like he was mandating for universal minimum wages because, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's not a new message from Elon. I would come back to, you used the word agency earlier. I think there's this assumption of agency, and that might be a little bit controversial. I was in Egypt about a month and a half ago, maybe longer, when we were talking about AI, and everybody said, what do you think the influence of AI will be? And I said, the important question is, what is the influence of AI now? And people were like, I think we're still trying to understand. I was like, no, who chose your music today? Like, and people were like, what do you mean? And I was like, who chose your YouTube channel? How did you get to work? Like, I don't think we believe there's agency. And I think that we have two pathways. We have this pathway towards, we believe we have control and we're going to fight for it, right? And that's one path. Another path is what depending on your belief system, people would just call acceptance. And I think there's an acceptance that we may or not have as much agency as we think already. So if that's the case, you can choose whatever path you want, right? But if that is the case, then how do you come to accept the role of AI in that it will start to make decisions, and that maybe you don't have as much agency as you think you do? When I think about it from a talent perspective, I do believe that we have to think about how do we amplify the innate humanness of what we do. And so in that way, everything that does not do that becomes delegated. And so if you use a specific use case example for what we do, years ago at Uber, I had a coordination team, amazing group of people, right? So they would take all of these people that wanted to meet and somehow put this all into a cauldron, and there would be a beautiful Google Calendar after, right? And it was amazingly hard work. But now with the advent of automation and AI tools, is it sensible to believe that a human should spend a whole day looking for white space in a Google Sheet or in a Google Calendar? It just doesn't make sense anymore, right? And so we allocate that off. And is me trying to find you a slot in the calendar, is that amplifying the innate humanness of what we do? Of course not, right? So we have to ask of ourselves, and then we have to ask of our teams and ask of those people we hire, what is the work that only you can do? And as AI can do more and more, my opinion is that we have no choice but to understand what is innately human about what we do, because at some stage, that may be what we have left, right? So you might as well get on with it now. So that's kind of how I process strategy for us from a talent perspective, and how I think about the evolution of our teams as well.
So, one final question. Um, Again, coming back to talent, for those who listen and want to think about, how to be successful in the professional world. When you look at your career, having worked at Apple, Uber, now Kareem, and other companies in between, what would be the two or three things you would say stood out amongst those people who excelled regardless of their level?
One of the values that I loved when I was at Apple was compassion. And it's a leadership and a human trait that I think that organizations don't value. They don't, may not because they don't value it. It just simply doesn't come into the commercial zeitgeist. I'd say that's one. I think that's important and often forgotten as we march towards financial goals, business goals, etc. We still have to be mindful that people have to do that, and people don't always have an easy time, right? So let's try to help. I think another trait that comes up in the most successful people is self-awareness, particularly in sustainably successful leaders. Is what is of course I have goals, but what is my impact on others? What do I want that impact to be? And then how do we go forward together? So that's very, very important. Lack of self-awareness I see as a career restrainer in a lot of senior leaders. And then the last one, I think I'm potentially biased on this one, but I think that there's sort of this combination of drive for results and bias for action. This belief that I can just get things done. And if I have to drive that forward, of course, I can't just do that by myself, generally speaking. But if you use those first two items, and I don't think this is an exhaustive list, but we have to have some kind of drive, to achieve, to build, to create, to insert whatever the word is here, because you can be the nicest person on earth, and you can be as strategic as you want, but if you can't bring things to life, becomes less material.
That's very, very true. I think that's a good list, for people to have. But compassion is a really beautiful one, because that is often something that gets, sidetracked in our quest to become successful.
Yeah.
Because
Yes.
it's competition and compassion kind of collide in some way.
Yeah.
But they don't have to. They don't have to.
They don't have to. And one thought on this, just briefly, just to maybe give people context, is I think that if you look at the data about successful workplaces, almost every organization you survey that has really highly productive and highly engaged teams, it comes down to an environment where there's a high degree of trust and psychological safety. And we can't achieve that without compassion. So I think if you really want to go into the white papers, I think it holds water.
Yeah. Well, great. Look, I think there's so much more that I could be going deeper into with you, and we have not at all even scratched the surface of your own professional journey, Rob. Let alone anything else. But thank you so much for the time here and for enlightening us on how you think, how organizations where you work, think, what people value, and ultimately what you control.
Mm,
So this has been a
absolutely.
terrific conversation, and thank you so much.
Oh, absolutely. My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Prashant.
Thanks for listening. If you found this conversation valuable, please leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you have a story or someone you know does, please recommend them to us by email at hello@lumi.network. We'll see you next time on In Youth We Trust.